Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In the Philippines, and good evening for everyone who are here in the States and in Canada. At magandang araw po kung saan mo po kayo naroroon. My name is Dr. Mario or Mariano Santo Domingo. Welcome to the parallel session 7.1 of the 40th annual Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering meeting or symposium, or what we call APAMS. I would like to dedicate this particular session to Dr. Severino Co, who is the founder of PAASE. Since this is the 40th anniversary, it's just fitting that we give tribute to him. And as the organizer of and the host of this session, I felt honored, to dedicate this session.
Researchers, industry, and even the government is really like.
Please mute your microphones, please. So I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Ko before he retired from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I learned from one of his contemporaries that he was a mentor of Neil Armstrong, who graduated from Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, where Dr. Ko was an aeronautics and astronautics engineering professor before he transferred to UMBC. Tonight, we are fortunate to have assembled a brilliant set of emerging and seasoned scholars and administrators to talk about the important topics of diversity, identity, and representation in various spheres such as higher education, STEM, and health careers. But first, I would like to again thank the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering for giving me the freedom to design this session according to what I thought are pressing issues confronting the Filipino-American community in the United States and their places and spaces in the larger American society. For about 15 minutes each, our speakers will present their ideas and research findings following the themes of their presentations. As you are listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to write your questions on the chat box, or if you're on YouTube, on the comment box. After the first three presentations, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A to be followed by the last two papers, then another round of Q&A. Without further ado, let me introduce the first talk, which I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Fritzie Aquino de Mata, my kababayan from Morong, Rizal. Dr. de Mata is currently the Associate Director of the Alumni Scholars Program at University of Berkeley, at the University of California in Berkeley. She graduated from Berkeley in 2005 with a degree in English and political science. After college, she attended UC Santa Cruz for her doctorate in literature, specializing in world literature, Asian American studies, critical race and ethnic studies, and critical theory. She is committed to diversity and justice in education as manifested in her work as a scholar, teacher, and mentor, and is passionate about issues relating to diaspora and migration. And briefly about myself, so again, I'm Mario Santo Domingo. I'm an associate research scientist at the Department of Psychology at UMBC. My doctorate was in human services psychology with specialization in community and applied social psychology. And for more than 2 decades, I have been involved with the Meyerhoff Scholars Program as one of the lead evaluators. I am also the founding president of the Lipunang Pangkasaysayan ng Morong, or Likas Morong, in Rizal Province, Philippines. Likas Morong is a community-based history and heritage society in Morong, Rizal, in the Philippines. Dr. de Mata's and my presentation is about theories, research, and practices related to Filipino-American identity and representation. We will be alternating in our presentation, and she will be giving the final words. Allow me first to start with a quote from Dr. Ann Aaron. Dr. Aaron is the Filipino director for encoding technologies at Netflix, and she was just a recipient of the PAASE Presidential Citation for Excellence, awarded 3 days ago. She expressed this, and I made sure I got her statement correctly. She said, "Sadly, I don't encounter a lot of people like me." And then she asked a question, "Why is there less of us?" And then she proffered an explanation. It is not a level playing field. This statement may be truncated, but it foreshadows the essence of our presentation, okay? With her expression of identity and representation or lack of it, and the factors outside of herself that contribute to it. But before I get ahead of myself, let me first give you an overview of our presentation. We'll start describing the Filipinos' long history of migration to the US, followed by some demographics of the Filipino-American population and some snapshots of representation data in higher education. Then we'll talk about a few lenses that scholars, scientists, and researchers use to study the Filipino-American and his experiences, his or her experiences, and then select research in areas of higher education and health. And then we will be touching upon some programs, practice and policy, and the final words from Dr. Demada. Fritzie?
Hi all, good afternoon. Very happy to be here today. I wanted to give a very brief overview of the Filipino migration in the United States. I call it a long history because our history has always been defined by US colonization and neocolonization of the Philippines, but US migration in the United States goes beyond that, and it's not always defined by colonization of the US. So even starting before the Spanish colonization of the Philippines in 763, the first settlement of Filipinos in the US was actually in St. Malo in New Orleans. 1763, Filipinos jumped ship from the Manila galleon trade and eventually settled in St. Malo, New Orleans. 1781, Antonio Miranda Rodriguez, who is a descendant of a Manila man, so there's a lot of Filipino seafarers even before that time, was one of the 12 founding settlers of Los Angeles. And so now I move on to US colonization of the Philippines. So Filipino migration to the United States has been largely determined by US imperialism and militarism, as well as the United States' demand for cheaper racialized labor. During the colonial period from 1898 to just before World War II, there's a lot of pensionados that went to the US, largely upper class males sent to study in the US and go back to the Philippines to hold high political and social positions. The biggest migration, one of the largest migrations of Filipinos was the migrant workers. In the 20s and 30s, largely male workers in the West Coast, agricultural workers in Hawaii and California, and workers in the Canaries in Alaska and Pacific Northwest. The migration during this period was predicated upon American empire's economic demand for cheap and racialized labor. So the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 restricted Asian migration in the US. In order to supply its labor needs, the US started importing Filipinos because during this time, Filipinos were considered US nationals, but not citizens, right? So this categorical loophole allowed the United States to source their labor needs from the Philippines because Filipinos could legally enter American borders. Post-World War II, there's a lot of World War II veterans, Filipinos, that helped fight with the US Army. So all the veterans and families were given opportunities to migrate. There's also wire brides. 1965 is also another big wave of migration from the Philippines. There's a mass migration of skilled professionals such as nurses, engineers, accountants, and doctors. But I just want to remind everyone that the migration of nurses began even before the 1960s. There's also a huge recruitment of Filipino men in the US Navy in the 70s. They recruited around 14,000 men, which is actually larger than the Philippine Navy. And then today, a lot of the migration that happens nowadays is through the family reunification.
According to the 2018 census, there are about 4,089,570 Filipinos in the US, and majority of them live in 5 states such as California, Hawaii, Texas, Nevada, and Washington. It used to be that among these top 5 states are Illinois and New York, but for reasons of demographic changes and mobility and economic factors, the 4th and 5th top states changed recently. Over the years, there have also been constant increases in the immigrant population numbers. These tables show the Filipino immigrant population as well as the total Filipino population over the decades up until 2018. The percent change from previous decades to more recent past are getting smaller, as you can see, due to varying factors such as political climate, economic conditions, including demand for labor. So with a long history of Filipino migration in the United States, it is now the 3rd largest growing Asian group next to Chinese and Asian Indians. It is important to mention again here that among this group are 2nd generation Filipinos, or those who have at least one Filipino immigrant parent, okay? So the Filipinos are the 6th largest 2nd generation population in the United States. Another very important information here is while 37% of Filipinos earn bachelor degrees, and it's pretty high, only 9% pursue postgrad degrees compared to 21% for all Asians. For all Americans, or for all the population, it's like 11, no, for white or Caucasians, it's 11%, but Filipinos are slightly less, but for all Asians, it's 21%. So you can see the difference there. Now, there are here the snapshots of data analysis done by Dr. Kevin Nadal in 2019, looking into the enrollment of different Asian groups in the University of California system. He found a large disparity between the enrollment rate of Filipinos and the proportion of their population relative to Asian American population in the state of California. In spite of the fact that they constitute 27% of California Asian American population, only 11% of University of California students were Filipinos, showing a difference of 16%. In contrast, other groups are at parity or overrepresented. Similarly, when comparing admission rates between Asian groups, the difference between the percentage of admitted Filipino-American students, which is 54%, is way below the admission rate for all Asians, which is 67%, for a disparity of 13%. Now, let us now shift our attention to how we study, view, and interpret data relative to Filipino experience in the United States. So what are these lenses? What are these models? What are these theories? I'll be remiss if I do not mention here Psikolohiyang Pilipino, as I was a student of Dr. Virgilio Enriquez, who was the founder or the leading theorist of SP. Dr. Enriquez brought SP to the United States. He wrote quite prolifically about it. And it is based on the full use of Filipino culture and language. Its body of knowledge include indigenous or indigenized concepts, research methods, and practices. These include, for example, the concepts of kapwa, loob, ginhawa, or the many different levels of pakikipagkapwa. Fritzie?
Thank you, Professor Santo Domingo. I also wanted to emphasize that the studies of identity and representation really also comes out of the history of the formation of ethnic studies and Asian American studies. So that's what I want to focus my attention during this presentation. So I want to start with the Third World Liberation Front strikes in 1968. This happened in SF State and UC Berkeley. So it is a coalition of student groups based on ethnic identities. It's internationalist movement. It was against capitalism, against imperialism, against war, specifically Vietnam War. This movement was beyond defending Asian Americans against racism and promoting Asian American identity. In fact, it was very much about the history of Black and Asian solidarity and the alliance of racialized minorities. It was Blacks, Asian Americans, during that time, Chicanos, Latinos, right? Native Americans coming together to demand changes in higher education. And one of the outcome of the strikes is it helped establish ethnic studies at SF State and UC Berkeley. And the first Asian American studies curricula at these campuses also came out of the strikes. So the movement really gave rise to an Asian American as a political and categorical identity. And I also wanted to emphasize that this movement saw themselves as part of the Third World. That's why it was called Third World Liberation Front. It was inspired by the Bandung Conference in 1955, the gathering of non-aligned African and Asian nations against colonialism and neocolonialism. So Asian American studies and Filipino American studies are very much, interrelated. Filipino American studies has ties to Philippine studies that is based in the Philippines and is also based in the US, but it's also a huge part of Asian American studies. So Filipinos during the Third World Liberation Strike were among the main ethnic groups together with Chinese and Japanese Americans that were behind the creation of the category Asian American, which later has been expanded to include other ethnic groups. So the Asian American identity and category was a pan-ethnic coalition built by political necessity to address Asian Americans' marginalization in the US Academy and society at large. Asian American studies used identity as a means for political representation. However, as we all know and starting to see in our presentation, and as it has been criticized in academy or even outside the academy, this category has always been incapable of fully representing what it aims to represent. It cannot represent the heterogeneity or the diversity of histories and experiences among Asian Americans. None of the other ethnic groups within this umbrella actually fits neatly into the paradigms of Asian American studies. And then I also wanted to focus on America's forgetfulness. Why are Filipinos described as invisible? So I wanted to talk about the concept of American exceptionalism and the notion of benevolent assimilation has contributed to America's forgetting. It is not so much that Filipinos are forgotten, but that Filipinos are rendered invisible because of how American imperialism has been framed, not only to the general American public, but even to us Filipinos. And sometimes a lot of our family even buys into this, that when colonization is framed as benevolent, an occupation instead of an actual colonization, or lifting up our little brown brothers, providing Filipinos with education or democracy, what becomes overlooked or what becomes hidden is the violent histories of American racialization and colonization of the Philippines, as well as the exploitation of Filipinos that build the United States what it is today, and also the unequal relationship between US and the Philippines that only benefits the United States.
Okay, I'll now present sample findings from both quantitative and qualitative research or reports. Just as what you can see in front of you right now, I organized the data from the University of California system, looking at the SAT scores from 2011 to 2016. As you can see, the graph shows that relative to the larger Asian category, Asians are considered overrepresented in STEM, for examples. Filipinos perform at much lower scores through 6 years between 2011 to 2016. And as you can see, although relatively higher, their scores are closer to the mean scores of Latinx and African American groups. Now, I was trying to understand this, and I came across and found an answer in a qualitative study done by Ocampo in 2013, where he concluded that Filipino Americans acquire what he calls a pan-minority identity, which shows an ethnic background, cultural upbringing, and educational experience closer to Latinx and African American cultures and experiences, rather than other Asian Americans in universities or those who are considered URMs. Now, the importance of disaggregating data have never been made really or shown as critical when it comes to health research. For example, In a study by Adia and colleagues just released in April 2020, Asians appeared healthier than did non-Hispanic whites on most health indicators. That seems really very good. However, when disaggregated, every Asian subgroup had at least one disparity. But Filipinos had the most disparities, with higher prevalence of fair or poor health, being obese or overweight, and having high blood pressure, diabetes, or asthma compared with non-Hispanic whites. Thus, failure to disaggregate health data disguises disparities and leads to inaccurate conclusions about needs for intervention and research, which we argue is also true in education. Now, this slide also shows what we can find when we disaggregate data. At 22.3%, Filipino adults are more likely than Chinese and other Asian groups to have several chronic conditions, including hypertension. Very recently, we heard the news that Filipinos are being hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the healthcare workers. Early reports indicated that 35% of deaths among Asian population and 40% of mortality rate among Philams infected, and this is much higher than the national rate according to Johns Hopkins University's dashboard of 3.7%. Now, driven by the need and interest to understand the Filipino experience in all its historical and social milieu and advance their interests, programs and practices have been slowly taking ground, albeit in a checkered and sometimes contentious manner. Here's Dr. Demada to describe some of these programs.
Thank you, Professor Santo Domingo. I just want to throw in a caveat in here. So this is a very broad overview of what has been going on in the UC system. As we all know, the very first Bulasan Center for Filipino Studies started in UC Davis 2018, and it was spearheaded by Robin Rodriguez, who was hired as an associate professor in Asian American Studies in 2011. So the focus on the center was a collection of stories from Filipino migrant workers, but I also wanted to emphasize that the beginnings of the program was really from grassroots organization. It was, the funding came from fundraising from the community. They raised $30,000, and then now they were able to get more funding from the state. And then there's the newest really amazing thing that happened recently in the UC system is the Filipino Studies minor at UCLA. I think it's a very unique in its kind, probably within the United States. It is within the UCLA's Asian American Studies department. It's just going to start this fall, 2020. It really came from a long history of advocacy from faculty, undergrad, grad students, and alumni for this to happen. It's an interdisciplinary program. They have at least 2 tenure-track Filipino-American professors. The chair of the Asian American Studies Department is Victor Bascara, who's currently the chair, and also Lucy Burns is there. And similar thing happened to Berkeley. The very first Filipino-American history course was taught in UC Berkeley's ethnic studies in 2004, right? So there's in the 80s and the 90s, especially in the 90s, there's a long history of students and undergrads and grads fighting for a Filipino-American Philippine Studies professor in the program. It wasn't until 2004 they hired Professor Catherine Sanisa Choi, whose work is on Filipino nurse migration. She was the first tenure professor to teach Filipino-American history at UC Berkeley before they would have lecturers, adjunct professors to teach the course. Similarly, UC Berkeley also has Tagalog language courses. It's primarily taught by adjunct lecturers. Even though it's the largest language program within Southeast Asian Studies. And currently, a couple of years ago, they were trying to raise money to start Philippine studies in the program. So a lot of what's happening in the UC system is really coming from, from the ground, grassroots organization to make some changes, and from the community.
And I would like to add also that at the University of Maryland, students need to raise funds for a course on Philippine history and culture to be offered every other semester or every other year. So you can see the burden on students just to make sure that some of these courses are offered on their campuses. Now, Dr. Dimara and I also looked for institutional policies that somehow are based from educational data, similar to what I presented earlier. And I remember what Dr. Zenia Tigno, who's our co-panelists here, about the University of California, San Francisco, or UCSF, that uses a definition that says at UCSF, our working definition of URM is someone whose racial or ethnic makeup is from one of the following. And among these are Asian, Filipino, Hmong, or Vietnamese only. Now, more diggings led us to the definition of the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, which adopted the definition of URM from UCSF in its position statement on diversity and inclusion in the physician workforce that was released late last year in December. So it seems like we can see some light, at the end of the tunnel. But my question is this change only true for health-related colleges, just such as UCSF, or professional organizations such as APA? Then I found this. I found this call to respond to a campus climate survey at UC Santa Cruz among its students, which uses the UCSF definition. I call this a ripple effect, albeit very small, showing that there may be hope for change in the future to correct what we argue are inequities in higher education and disparities in health. And for our final words, here again is Dr. Dimara.
I think throughout our presentation, we have pointed out that there is a limitation to the Asian American category, that it somehow renders Filipino Americans invisible as well, but it also doesn't fit to really represent our experiences. There is so much of us here looking at our population growth, looking at our students within the UC system. We exist, but we are not heard. There is a lack of institutional support. Right? So there are many Filipino Americans, academics writing about the Philippines and the Filipino American experience. There are a lot of us trying to change the knowledge production, but our stories are not given many platforms to be told in the academy. So we really need structural support to flourish. We need structural changes to address Filipinos' marginalization in higher education and the importance of mentorship and allyship. We need to mentor others and help lift them up. We need to build communities with other marginalized communities on how we can lift each other up and how we can stand right next to each other to fight injustice.
Thank you, Dr. Dimara. That ends our presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please write them on the comment or the chat box, and we will respond to your questions after the third presentation.